The afternoon sun was a hammer, pounding the air into dust. Clara stood at the edge of the road, trembling. She had nothing left but her shame. 3 men, her dead husband's family, had made sure of that. They paraded her ruin like it was some kind of sick justice. Their wagon stood there, stained with sweat, their eyes glittering with a cold, ugly satisfaction. They believed possession was the same thing as right, and into this hellscape a rider appeared. His name was Thomas. The words he spoke weren't a question. They weren't a command. They were a fact, carved into the dry air. "You're coming with me." He swung off his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove and even less to fear. Dust clung to his boots, his coat, his jaw, but his eyes never left Clara. He saw the shaking in her shoulders. He saw the way she stared at the horizon, refusing to look at her tormentors, refusing to even look at him. One of the men, the oldest Grayson, spat in the dirt. His voice was like broken glass. "She's ours. Debt paid. You've no claim here, Thomas." The poison in his words hung in the air. This was their family honor. This was their right. But Thomas didn't waste his breath arguing. He moved with a deliberate silence, pulling a thick wool blanket from his saddle. His hands were steady as he draped it over Clara's bare shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. He was giving her back a piece of what they'd stolen. Then he turned to face the 3 men. His voice was low, but it cut through the heat like a razor. It had the finality of a coffin lid shutting for good. "Get off my land." The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. A line had been drawn, not just in the dust, but in something far more important: dignity. But the Graysons just smirked. The oldest one laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Your land. Thomas, this road belongs to the territory, and this woman, she belongs to us until the debt is square." He gestured to Clara, a piece of property to be claimed. Thomas didn't even flinch. His gaze was as hard as the rock under their feet. "The road might be territory," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "But the ground your feet are on, that's mine. And everything under this sky that my shadow can touch, that's mine too. Now I'm only gonna say it one more time." He took a single step forward. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The sons shifted on their feet, their hands drifting towards the knives on their belts. But the old man saw something in Thomas's eyes, something ancient and unbreakable, something that told him this wasn't a fight they could win today. With a final curse, he motioned for his sons. They climbed back onto the wagon, their cruelty soured by this unexpected defiance. As they rode away, the oldest yelled back, "This ain't over, Thomas. The law will see it our way." Thomas watched them disappear into a cloud of their own dust. He didn't relax, not even for a second. He just turned back to Clara, his expression unreadable. He had won the first battle. But that threat about the law, that was a seed of trouble planted in scorched earth, just waiting for the first rain to grow. And as he helped Clara onto his horse, she felt a new kind of fear. She wasn't just escaping her past, she was riding straight into his, and she had no idea what kind of trouble that was. The road stretched on, merciless under the sinking sun. Clara sat in front of Thomas on the saddle, wrapped in the rough wool, her back pressed against the solid wall of his chest. Every thud of the horse's hooves took them further from her humiliation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just trading one cage for another. The silence between them was thick, heavy with things unsaid. Thomas didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. He just rode on, his presence a steady, unyielding force. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't waiting for a cruel hand or a harsh word. But this silence was a different kind of prison. It was a vacuum, and her fears rushed in to fill it. Who was this man? Why had he intervened? The Graysons knew him. They called him by his name. "You've no claim here, Thomas," they'd said. It wasn't the kind of thing you say to a stranger. It was the kind of thing you say to someone with a history. The sky bled crimson and orange, the colors of a fresh wound. The sagebrush whispered secrets on the wind. Clara felt like a ghost, suspended between one life that was over and another that hadn't yet begun. Then she saw it, a tiny spark in the distance, a lantern, a destination, a house. The sight of it pierced the fragile calm she'd found in the rhythm of the horse. Fear, sharp and familiar, coiled in her gut. What was waiting for her there? What price would this rescue demand? The Graysons had spoken of a debt. What if Thomas was just another creditor? A different kind of man, maybe, but one who would still expect to be paid. The tiny flame flickered in the growing dark, a promise she was too terrified to trust. The horse kept walking. Thomas kept his silence. And Clara realized with a cold dread that she knew nothing about the man who had just saved her life. She was completely at his mercy. And mercy was something she hadn't seen in a very, very long time. The valley opened up before them, a hidden bowl sheltered by dark ridges. At its center was a ranch, a sturdy house, a barn, a web of fences. It looked like it had grown right out of the earth. When the horse stopped, Clara tried to slide down, but her legs gave out. She was weaker than she thought. Thomas dismounted first, then turned and lifted her down. His hands were calloused and circled her waist for just a moment, steadying her until she could stand on her own. There was no presumption in his touch, just a quiet respect that felt foreign and shocking. Inside, the house was simple, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, handmade chairs. It smelled of wood smoke and clean earth. It was the house of a man who lived alone. Thomas pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours," he said, his voice even. "There are clothes on the bed. They were my mother's." Clara went into the room. A simple dress and a shift were folded on the quilt. They smelled of lye soap and sunshine. She shed the wool blanket, the last remnant of her public shame, and slipped into the clean clothes. They were loose, but they felt like armor. When she came back out, a fire was crackling in the hearth. 2 plates of beans and bacon sat on the table. Thomas moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasting a motion. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the sigh of the flames. He didn't ask her story. His kindness demanded no explanation, no payment. For Clara, just sitting at a table, clothed and fed, was a miracle. It was the first step back from the edge. But as she looked around the small, sparse room, her eyes caught something on the mantelpiece. It was a faded photograph, not of a stern-looking woman who might be his mother, but of a young woman with a shy smile and eyes full of life. Beside her stood a younger, happier Thomas. It wasn't his mother. It was his wife. And on the nail below the photograph, hanging from a leather cord, was a simple silver locket. It was tarnished with age, but Clara recognized it instantly. It was hers. Her husband had given it to her on their wedding day. She thought she'd lost it months ago, back at their farm. Back before he died. How did it get here? The food turned to ash in her mouth. The warmth of the fire felt like a sudden chill. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. This man, this savior. He was connected to her past in a way she couldn't understand. He wasn't a stranger. He was a secret. And she was trapped in his house with no idea what that secret was. The days that followed were a quiet torment. Thomas rose before dawn and worked his land with a relentless energy. He left food on the table for her each morning, bread, stew, dried meat, and never asked for anything in return. He gave her space. He gave her solitude. But it wasn't a refuge. It was a cage made of questions. Clara stayed inside, exploring the corners of the life she'd been forced into. She found a collection of small, carved wooden birds on a shelf, their edges worn smooth. She found the faded photograph of the stern woman she now knew was his mother. But her eyes always returned to the mantelpiece, to the picture of the smiling wife and the locket that was hers. She didn't dare touch it. She didn't dare ask about it. To ask the question would be to break the fragile peace, to admit she knew something was wrong. What was worse? The cruelty of the Graysons, which was honest in its ugliness, or this quiet, unnerving kindness from a man who held a piece of her past hostage? One afternoon, the house felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. She stepped onto the porch, blinking in the bright sun. In the distance, Thomas was mending a fence, the rhythmic strike of his hammer the only sound in the valley. He saw her. He had to. His hammering paused for a single beat. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge her. He just went back to his work, granting her the dignity of being ignored. But it didn't feel like dignity. It felt like he was hiding. It felt like he couldn't look her in the eye, and that's when she saw it. A speck on the eastern ridge, a lone rider sitting perfectly still on his horse. He was too far away to make out any details, but his stillness was deliberate. He was watching the ranch. He was watching them. Clara's blood ran cold. It had to be one of the Graysons, a scout, a warning. The figure stayed there for nearly an hour, an unmoving shadow before finally turning and disappearing back over the ridge. The valley no longer felt safe. It felt exposed, trapped. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Thomas did something he hadn't done before. He laid a piece of oiled cloth on the table and began to clean his rifle. The methodical scrape of the brush, the click of the parts snapping back into place. These were the actions of a man preparing for a war. He didn't say a word about the rider on the ridge. He didn't have to. He had seen him, too. Clara sat by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. She had thought his protection was a moment of pity on the road. But this was different. This was a commitment. He was preparing to defend this place, to defend her. But the question still burned in her mind, hotter than the fire in the hearth. Was he protecting her from the Graysons? Or was he protecting himself? The locket on the mantelpiece seemed to gleam in the firelight, a silent, silver accusation. He knew more than he was saying. He knew her husband, and he had a secret big enough to kill for. And she was right in the middle of it. The storm hit without warning. A low moan rolled down from the mountains, and the sky turned a bruised purple. Rain lashed against the roof, and the little house seemed to shrink against the wind's fury. Just as the storm reached its peak, a sound pierced through the chaos, a panicked, desperate bleating from the lambing pen. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots. He grabbed a lantern, his jaw set. He didn't look back as he plunged into the roaring night. But something pulled at Clara, a strange impulse she couldn't name. She couldn't just sit here, waiting in this house of secrets. She had to do something, anything. She followed him into the storm. The yard was a swirling nightmare of wind and mud. The lantern light threw wild, dancing shadows. They reached the pen where a ewe was struggling in the wet straw, her sides heaving. Thomas knelt beside her, his movements calm and sure, his voice a low murmur to the panicked animal. Clara stood at the gate, frozen, her heart pounding with the rhythm of the thunder. Then Thomas jerked his head toward her. "Hold this." He thrust the lantern into her hands. She fumbled, but her fingers closed around the warm glass, and the simple act of holding it steady grounded her. She knelt across from him, the rain plastering her hair to her face, the wind trying to steal the light. But she held it firm, focused, aiming the beam so he could see. His focus was absolute. He worked with a gentle precision, turning the lamb inside the ewe. The minutes stretched on, each one an eternity. Then, with a final, careful pull, the small body slid free. It was slick and terribly, terribly still. For a single awful heartbeat, the world stopped. The wind, the rain, Clara's breath. It all vanished. Then Thomas grabbed a piece of burlap and began rubbing the tiny lamb, his big hands rough but desperate. A shudder ran through the little body, and then a weak, broken cry split the night. Clara gasped, a sob of relief tearing from her throat. The ewe nosed her newborn. It was trembling, but it was alive. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara didn't feel like a victim. She didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a part of something. They had fought the storm together and pulled a little piece of life back from the edge. She looked up, and Thomas was watching her. His face was impossible to read in the flickering light, but his gaze held hers for a long moment. It was a look of acknowledgement, a look that said, "You belong here." When they got back to the house, soaked and exhausted, the feeling lingered. Clara stood by the fire, wrapped in a dry blanket, and she broke the silence. "Thank you." It wasn't for the roof over her head or the food. It was for trusting her to hold the light. Thomas just nodded, but the silence that settled between them now felt different. It wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was shared. Later that night, after Thomas had gone to his room, Clara couldn't sleep. The little victory in the storm had given her a sliver of courage. She walked to the mantelpiece. Her hand trembled as she reached for the silver locket. She clicked it open. She was expecting to see the tiny, faded portrait of her late husband. But the space was empty. The picture was gone. That wasn't right. She had never taken it out. She turned the locket over in her palm. On the back, almost too faint to see, were two tiny scratched initials, T.A. Thomas Abel. This wasn't her locket. It looked exactly like it, but it wasn't. It belonged to his dead wife. Her name must have been Anna or Abigail. A new, more terrible thought took root in her mind. Her husband hadn't just bought her a locket. He had bought her a copy of another woman's locket. A woman who was married to the silent, watchful man who now held Clara's life in his hands. Why? The storm outside had passed, but inside Clara, a hurricane was just beginning. After the storm, a fragile peace settled over the valley. Clara started to venture out more, her bare feet pressing into the damp earth. She found a small, neglected garden behind the house and began to pull the weeds, her hands finding a strange comfort in the soil. She found a stubborn sprig of wild mint and tended to it. A few days later, she left a glass of cool mint water on the porch for Thomas when he came in from the fields. He paused, looked at the glass, then at her. He drank it, nodded once, and that was enough. She started to mend his shirts, sweep the floors, bring order to the quiet neglect of his home. These weren't chores. They were acts of claiming a space, of building a life from the wreckage. Every stitch, every swept corner was a declaration. I am more than what was done to me. But the mystery of the locket gnawed at her. The piece she was building felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse with a single breath of truth. One evening, sitting by the fire, she finally found the courage to speak. Her voice was steady as she told him her story. She told him about her husband, a kind man, she said, but weak. She told him about the fever that took him, the debts, and the cruelty of the Graysons. She told him everything. Everything except her own growing suspicion. Thomas listened without interruption. His eyes stayed on the flames, but a muscle in his jaw clenched and unclenched. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a cold, controlled fury. He was a man holding back an ocean of rage. He made a silent vow in that moment, that the cruelty of the world would never touch her again while she was under his roof. And Clara, watching him, felt a pang of guilt. Here was a man who had saved her, who was ready to fight for her, and she was suspecting him of... what? She wasn't even sure. She decided to let it go. The past was the past. This valley, this quiet life, was her future. She wouldn't let a strange coincidence poison it. The next day she felt lighter. The suspicion was a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. She worked in the garden, humming a tune she thought she'd forgotten. Later, while tidying Thomas's room, a room she had never dared enter before, she found a small wooden box tucked under his bed. It wasn't locked. Curiosity, now unburdened by fear, got the better of her. She opened it. Inside were letters, tied with a faded ribbon. They were from his wife, Amelia, and tucked in with them was a single folded piece of paper that wasn't a letter. It was a deed to her husband's farm, the one the Graysons had taken. It was dated 2 weeks before her husband died, and it was signed over to Thomas. He hadn't just saved her. He owned her past. He owned the land her husband had left her in debt for. The Graysons hadn't been lying. They did have a claim. Thomas had bought the debt, bought the farm, right out from under them. And he had never said a word. The lie was staggering. His quiet kindness, his protection, it was all built on a foundation of deceit. He wasn't her savior. He was her landlord, her owner. She heard the crunch of his boots on the porch. He was back early. She slammed the box shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here another minute. She was a fool to have trusted him. He was no better than the Graysons, just quieter in his cruelty. She ran for the door, but he was already there, blocking her path. His face wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was full of pity. "Clara," he said, his voice soft. "Don't." "You lied to me," she whispered, the words choked with betrayal. "All of it. It was a lie." "It's not what you think," he started. But then his eyes shifted, looking past her, out the window. The look on his face changed from pity to cold, hard readiness. "It's too late," he said, his voice flat. "They're here." Clara turned and looked. Cresting the ridge weren't 3 riders. There were 5, the 3 Graysons, and with them 2 other men. One wore the dusty badge of a territorial sheriff. The other was a stranger, with the cold, dead eyes of a bounty hunter. They weren't here to make threats this time. They had come with the law, and they were here for her. The 5 riders entered the yard, kicking up dust. The Grayson patriarch sat his horse with a smug confidence, flanked by his sons. But all eyes were on the man with the badge. Sheriff Miller was a hard man, but known to be fair. The bounty hunter next to him just looked mean. "Thomas," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "I've got a warrant here, issued for one Clara Miller, for the murder of her husband, Daniel Miller." Clara felt the world tilt. Murder? They were accusing her of murder? Daniel had died of a fever. The whole town knew that. It was a lie, a vicious lie to get her back. "That's a lie, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice steady as stone. He hadn't moved from the doorway. He was a barrier between her and them. "You know it is. Daniel died of lung fever." The oldest, Grayson, sneered. "He died, all right, but it wasn't no fever. We found evidence, things she hid. We believe she poisoned him, to get the farm." "A farm she no longer owned," Thomas countered, his voice like ice. "A farm I bought the debt on 2 weeks before he passed. Why would she kill him for something that was already mine?" The sheriff looked uneasy. This was getting complicated. "That's for the judge to decide, Thomas. All I know is I have a warrant. I need you to step aside and let me take the woman." "No," Thomas said. The word was absolute. The bounty hunter shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The man says no, Sheriff. That's resisting. That gives us cause." Clara's mind was racing. This was all happening because of the deed. Thomas had bought the farm to protect her, to remove the Graysons' claim. But in doing so, he'd given them a motive for her to kill her own husband. His act of protection had become the weapon they would use to destroy her. "Thomas, don't," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "You can't fight them all." He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw a crack in his stoic facade. She saw fear, not for himself, but for her. "Go back inside," he said, his voice low. "Bar the door. They'll burn the house down. Just do it." She backed away, her hands trembling. She couldn't leave him out here alone. The sheriff sighed. "Don't make this ugly, Thomas. I've known you a long time. I don't want this to end badly." "It already has," Thomas said. He slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty. "But you're not taking her." The bounty hunter smiled, a predator's grin. "I think we are." He spurred his horse forward, but before he could move 2 feet, a voice cut through the air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Everyone turned. Standing at the corner of the barn was an old woman. She was weathered and tough, her hair in a tight gray bun. In her hands she held an ancient-looking shotgun, and it was aimed right at the bounty hunter's chest. It was the stern-faced woman from the photograph, Thomas's mother. She wasn't dead. She was very, very alive, and she looked furious. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, clearly flustered, "this is official business." "This is my home," she replied, her voice like gravel. "And you've got 5 guns pointed at my son. That makes it my business. Now you want to talk about murder? Let's talk about the murder of Amelia Abel." The name dropped like a stone into a deep well. Thomas flinched as if he'd been struck. The bounty hunter's cold eyes widened, just for a second. The Graysons looked confused. Clara stared, her mind reeling. Amelia, the wife in the picture, the owner of the locket. "Amelia died in a fire," the sheriff said slowly. "Years ago. It was an accident." "It was no accident," Thomas's mother said, her knuckles white on the shotgun. "She was killed. And the man who killed her is sitting right there on that horse." She wasn't looking at the Graysons. She was looking straight at the bounty hunter. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the yard. The bounty hunter, whose name no one had even asked, slowly raised his hands away from his gun. His dead eyes were fixed on Thomas's mother. "You're crazy, old woman," he hissed. "My name is Martha Abel," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I don't forget a face, especially the face of the man who burned my daughter-in-law alive in her own home." The sheriff looked completely lost. "Martha, what is this? Amelia was Thomas's wife. This man is a hired gun from down south, name of Kane. He has no connection to this valley." "He does now," Martha said. "He came back. I saw him on the ridge 2 days ago, scouting us, just like he did back then. I knew he'd be back for my son eventually." Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse with a pain that was years old. "Mother, no." "It's time, Thomas," she said, her eyes never leaving Kane. "The truth has to come out. All of it." The oldest Grayson, smelling an opportunity, spurred his horse forward. "What is this nonsense? We came here for a killer. A woman who poisoned my kin." "Your kin," Martha spat, turning the shotgun on him for a beat, "was a snake, and he got what he deserved." Clara gasped. "That's enough," the sheriff yelled, finally finding his authority. "Everyone, shut your mouths." He looked at Thomas. "Son, you better start talking. Right now. What is she talking about?" Thomas looked at Clara. The secrets he'd held back for years were now a tidal wave about to crash down on all of them. He took a deep breath. "Daniel Miller didn't die of a fever," he said, the words tasting like poison. "And Clara didn't kill him." He paused, his gaze finding Clara's, full of apology. "I did." The confession hung in the air, more shocking than any gunshot. Clara felt her knees buckle. The Graysons erupted in furious shouts. The sheriff drew his gun. "No!" Clara screamed, finding her voice. "No! He's lying! He wasn't there!" "He was there," Martha said grimly. "And so was I." Thomas ignored them all, his eyes locked on the bounty hunter, Kane. My wife, Amelia, she and Daniel Miller's wife. They were sisters. This new revelation sent another shock wave through the yard. Not sisters, Thomas corrected himself, his voice thick with disgust. Clara was Daniel's wife. Amelia. Amelia was his first wife, the one everyone thought ran off years ago. It was impossible, a lie. Clara was his only wife. He told everyone she left him, Thomas continued, the story pouring out of him now. But she didn't leave. She ran. She ran from him because he was a monster. She came to me, begging for help. We fell in love. We got married under my mother's name, Abel, to hide her. But Daniel found out. He couldn't stand that she'd escaped, that she was happy. His eyes blazed with a fire hotter than any forge. So he hired this piece of trash, he said, nodding at Kane, to get her back. When she wouldn't go, Kane burned our cabin to the ground, with her inside. The horror of it was absolute. The quiet man she'd lived with, the man she thought was her savior, then her captor, was a widower whose wife had been murdered. And her own husband was the man who ordered it, the kind, weak man she had mourned. It was all a lie. Her entire life was a lie. Daniel thought he got away with it, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He married again. He married you, Clara. But the debt on his farm was coming due. He came to me, begging for money to pay it off. He knew I had it saved. The arrogance of the man, asking me to save the farm he bought with the blood of my wife. That's when I confronted him, about Amelia. He laughed. He told me everything. How he paid Kane, how he watched her die. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. I didn't mean to kill him. We fought. He fell and hit his head on the hearthstone. It was an accident born from a rage I couldn't control. I covered it up. I said it was a fever. I did it to protect you, Clara, so you wouldn't be tied to a murderer's legacy, so you wouldn't have to carry his sins. He looked at her, his soul bared. Buying the farm. It wasn't about owning you. It was about severing the last tie the Graysons had to you, to set you free. The truth was finally out, ugly, brutal, and world-shattering. The sheriff, his face pale, slowly lowered his gun and turned to Kane. Is this true? Kane just smiled, that dead, cold smile. There's no proof, just the ramblings of a crazy old woman and a killer. Oh, there's proof, Martha said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. A silver locket. Amelia was wearing this when he killed her, she said. I found it in the ashes. The chain was melted, but the locket survived. And I bet if you open it up, you'll find a picture of my son. And on the back, you'll find Kane's initials, scratched in by his own knife, a trophy from his work. Kane's smile vanished. He went for his gun. But Thomas was faster. The fight that had started years ago with fists and fire ended now in a blur of motion. Thomas tackled Kane off his horse, and the two men hit the ground in a cloud of dust. The sheriff and the Graysons scrambled back. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution of justice, long delayed. Thomas's grief and rage, bottled up for years, was finally unleashed. When it was over, Kane wasn't moving, and Thomas stood up, bruised and bloody, but finally free. The aftermath was a quiet chaos. The sheriff, looking 10 years older, arrested the two Grayson sons as accessories after the fact for filing a false report and bringing a known killer onto private land. The old man Grayson just sat on his horse, his face a mask of defeated rage, before turning and riding away without a word. His cruel empire had crumbled into dust. Thomas stood before the sheriff, his hands out, ready for the cuffs. I killed Daniel Miller. I'm ready to answer for it. Sheriff Miller looked from Thomas to Clara, then to the unmoving body of Cain. He looked at Martha, still holding that shotgun like it was a part of her arm. "From what I heard," the sheriff said slowly, "Daniel Miller died of a terrible fever, a tragedy for his whole family." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "As for this trash," he nodded at Cain, "looks to me like he resisted arrest and got what was coming to him. A clear case of self-defense." He holstered his pistol. "I'll take the Graysons into town. My advice to you, Thomas, is to bury your trash and get back to your life." With that, he tipped his hat to Martha, gathered his prisoners, and rode out of the valley, leaving silence in his wake. The storm was finally over. Clara walked over to Thomas. He wouldn't meet her eyes, ashamed of the violence she'd witnessed, of the truth he'd hidden. She gently took his bruised and bloodied hand. "You didn't lie to me," she said softly. "You just told the truth slowly." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of years of pain. "I'm sorry, Clara. For all of it. For what he was. For what I did." "You did what you had to do," she said. "You protected her, and then you protected me." Martha came over and handed Clara the locket, the one from the ashes. It felt warm in her palm, proof of a life, a love, and a terrible injustice. This valley wasn't just a refuge. It was a sanctuary, built on a foundation of terrible secrets, but sealed with courage and a fierce, quiet love. It was a place where two broken souls, scarred by the same monster, could finally begin to heal. They had a lot to rebuild. Not fences or barns, but trust, a future. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that no longer looked like a wound, but like a promise, they stood together. Not as a savior and a victim, not as a landlord and a debtor, but as two people who had walked through the fire and found each other on the other side. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something realer and stronger. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the only way to get justice is to make it yourself, and the only way to build a home is to defend it with everything you have. Strength isn't about being the loudest or the cruelest. It's the quiet integrity of a man who stands between the innocent and the dark. It's the quiet bravery of a woman who refuses to be defined by her scars. And when those two strengths come together, they can build a sanctuary in the middle of any wilderness. If you were moved by Clara and Thomas's fight for justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of survival and redemption. And let us know in the comments what you think the true meaning of strength really is.